Welcome back to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today we're talking with Christine Miller and we're talking about enterprise risk management. Chris, great first segment. I had another question. I was wondering, how does the enterprise risk management methodology unfold and what does it entail?
A very good question too, Alex. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, there isn't an enterprise risk management standard yet. So we're reliant on 31,000, which is the international standard for risk. And it's a generic standard and it's a guidance. It's not a certifiable standard. And interestingly, when you look at who was on the committee for 31,000, mm, there are a lot of Australians because the predecessor to that was ASNZS, which is the Australian New Zealand standard 43, 4360. And for those of us who got a dusted off old copy, it looks fairly similar.
I
But
think I
to
have an
just
old
break it
copy
down,
somewhere.
oh, you do.
I think
To
so.
just break it down, we've got principles, framework, and process. And a lot of the discussion we'll be having today is about process. How do you get there? And you can read all about it in the 31,000 if you don't have a copy. They're expensive, I'm sorry. But that's basically about risk identification and assessment. You need to understand the context in which your business, your entity operates. And what are the potential risks and evaluating those in terms of likelihood and impact? How likely is it to happen? Often, when I'm having that likelihood discussion with clients and colleagues, I say, has this ever happened? Have you ever had a tsunami? Have you ever had a volcanic eruption? Whatever the hell else it might be. And I remember having that discussion about tsunami when I worked for Geoscience Australia. And my geophysical, what they call paleogeologist colleagues said, "Oh yes, yes, we had a tsunami up the Sydney Basin 40,000 years ago. We've got the rocks to prove it. Do you want to have a look at the fossils?" Oh, you had what? And so there was a 20-foot tsunami up the Sydney Basin. Oh, that'd be wonderful if we had a 2-inch tsunami or a 2-foot tsunami. We'd probably take out the Sydney Harbour Bridge because we damaged the underlying foundation. Oh, that would be wonderful. I don't think. But the point is, often when you start to look at the context, when you bring the expert people into the discussion, the answers can be quite alarming and surprising. But you need to consider what the potential risks are and evaluate the likelihood. Has it happened ever before? In geological time, 40,000 years is sort of yesterday. And then what would the impact be? I jokingly mentioned if it was high enough, you'd knock out Sydney Harbour Bridge and the tunnel underneath it. That would be very bad news for one of our largest city in Australia. And then you think about risk response. So you think about strategies. What are you going to do to mitigate it? Well, you're not going to be able to mitigate the tsunami. There might be other things that you can mitigate in your business. What could you do that would be useful? So, for instance, the drones I mentioned in the earlier segment, they meant that we've had much better patrols. So when dolphins and other creatures get tangled up in the shark nets, we can get boats out and get them away and safe much quicker. Well, it can make a real difference in terms of mitigating the outcomes. And it can be the same in your business. If you understand where your business is heading, how are you going to respond? Again, I gave you that example of News Corp. Are we moving away from newspapers to more high-end, high-quality, glossy, photographic type publications? And monitoring and control. Again, if you look at that diagram in 31,000 about process, monitoring and control was central. You need to understand what the risks are. And risk profile may change over time. Excuse me. It certainly will change over time. Just have a quick drink. It will change over time, and you need to be understanding how that's changed.
How do you do that though? How do you go about
How you
monitoring
control
something over time when you mentioned earlier the point on a risk register, there can be so much there. So how can you monitor everything?
it. You just go for the big ticket item.
Hmm.
You can't monitor everything. So you look at the ones that have had the highest impact on your business and the highest likelihood. So when you do your risk matrix assessment, you're looking at likelihood and consequence or impacts. So you go for the big ones and you see if you can reduce them. To give you a real world example again, when I worked in a hospital, now obviously one of the things that is relevant in a hospital is feeding the patients. And it turned out that when I did some work with the kitchen, that some clever person had taken the thermostat controls off a device that they had. So they had this thing called cook chill. So they cook all these meals up and then they put them in this chilling thing and then they send them up to the ward and the staff would nuke them in a microwave and feed them to the staff in a warm and fit condition. At least that was the plan. Now, when those cook chill devices were purchased, they ordered them with a thermometer which would monitor the temperature. You know, often when you go into a shop, you see the temperature control on the freezers or
Mhm.
chill devices. It's that sort of thing, but on a much bigger scale. Anyway, somebody took that out of the order. Now, of course, that increased the risk of failure because they didn't have that monitoring device. The chances of it failing were much, much greater. So one of the risk activities, mitigations that we put in place there was we put the thermometers back on. Now, retrofitting was more expensive than had it been done at the get-go, but we identified this and we moved their risk rating down from very high likelihood of failure and consequence down to a much more modest situation.
Well, the problem there too is if without the temperature gauge, you could uh, give the staff food poisoning. You
Of
know,
course.
things that are sitting there for a while in not the proper temperatures, creating bacteria, and then that. So there's a whole
Mm,
new risk there that was created, actually.
exactly. And that's why mitigation is so important. So you need to identify your risk, you need to analyze the risk, and you need to look at mitigation. But you also need to monitor and control it if you can, and communicate it. So, for instance, when I worked with the kitchen people, I was able to communicate that to my general manager, who it turned out she had a little bit of unspent money towards the end of the year and was able to invest in reducing the risk in that part of her business. So you can see how it all fits in with decision making, fits in with wise business practice and good governance and good management of your resources.
And the opportunity. Putting
Exactly.
those using the gauges again as an example, that's an opportunity to reduce the risk of food poisoning.
Yeah. And when you're in hospital, you look forward to your meals. Well, you
Yeah.
hope you do. At least I knew the people in the kitchen worked incredibly hard to try and make sure people had nutritious and interesting meals. So it all works together. Happy patients, happy staff.
With the communication and reporting, do you once again just focus on those top risks? And I assume those
Yeah,
risks go to leadership, right? But how do you communicate the other ones? Because you also mentioned monitoring control. What happens when one of those risks that have not been monitored that well suddenly starts to creep up that ladder?
and that often is picked up at the lower levels of your organization. And that's why I try to encourage people, both in the business continuity space, but the broader risk management space, to make it a team sport. The more eyes you have on the problem, the better. So, for instance, I encourage the senior managers to, in their team meetings, actually discuss the risk profile
Hmm.
to see if there are some solutions. And for instance, that example of the cook chill thing is in the thermometers. Actually, that came out of a discussion with some quite lower level staff who knew how to fix it
Hmm.
and were very disappointed that somebody further up the totem pole in the budget decisions cut that out of the budget proposal. because they understood the implications. Your point about food poisoning and goodness knows what else adverse outcomes.
Yeah.
But whoever was making the budget decisions didn't understand the impacts of that decision or potential impacts. So it if you get enterprise risk, an understanding of risk management throughout the organisation at all levels, and of course that would start at the operational level, and that feeds into a much better outcome for your business.
Well, you bring up a good point there. How do you bring those together? Because quite often, and I've worked on many projects and programs where we identify risks, and the further it goes up the chain, the less attention it seems to get. Oh, that's not a big deal. That's just them worrying about things. That kind of mentality. We don't need to create fear or anything. So how do you uh, go about bringing those two aspects together, the enterprise level, where leadership is looking at all the risks, with sometimes these operational risks that creep up and then, to use your expression earlier, bite you in the bum.
And that's why it's so important to structure your risk register in terms of enterprise risks and then your operational tactical risks so that you can see how they all fit together. And to encourage your managers to actually look at that. So for instance, the cook chill example, how that came to the fore was I was brought into the office of my group manager. So this is a person just below a deputy CEO, and in a hospital, that's a and a health service, that's a pretty important person. They would have hundreds of staff and millions of dollars of budget. And when she looked at her risk assessment, where it was a very high impact and a very high likelihood, she went, "Oh, tell me more about this," because that would reflect badly on her when that was presented to the Risk and Audit Committee. So they would be looking at the risk register and they'd be looking at what we call all the red lights and the amber ones sometimes too. And they'd see this as a red light and no, I don't want to have too many red lights being observed by my colleagues. I want to move them at least down to amber and better again into green would be good. And how could I do that? So I was able to quickly explain to her that, as it had been explained to me by the operational people, that there was a solution and that it actually wasn't very expensive and that it was a one-off expense. So because she had these capital funds that she could invest, she moved that quickly out of red and into amber very fast because she made that decision. So she had the evidence from the operational risk people that she could make an enterprise risk decision that would reflect better into that whole collection of operational risks under that space for her oversight.
Is that a risk in itself? The point that you brought forward of some people seeing so many red flags, so they're like, no, 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 that's not a real risk. Downgrade it, simply because they don't like seeing red. Even though if there is a lot of red, it doesn't mean anything has been inflated just to get, some risk or somebody's personal perception on this risk register. It's real, but leadership doesn't like seeing red. So
No,
how
they don't.
how do you deal with that when someone says, no, no, that's not a real risk, but your operational team is saying, yes, yes, it is.
Well, another example, some years ago when I was a brand new business continuity manager, I went to a deputy secretary, so an important person. There were six of them in this organisation, so a pretty big organisation. And I presented him with 23 mission critical activities in the business continuity space. So these were things that, through all the work that we've done from the grassroots up, had been identified as really significant and impactful risks for his business. If these things failed, there would be consequences. And I left his office with eight. So I walked in with 23 and I left with eight.
Hmm. Wow.
Now, it wasn't because he was some sort of reckless person and disregarded the advice of his more junior staff. No, 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 no. And it was fascinating to listen to how he turned some of that thinking around because Often more operational staff don't understand the full scope of some of the issues for the enterprise, which of course at his level he would, and very political and financial and a whole lot of other issues
Right.
that really don't impact very much in the operational space, not in the direct sense. And one that sticks out in my mind was something to do with social security. And in Australia, if you receive a social security payment, like an age pension and the like, every quarter you have a slight adjustment based on CPI, Consumer Price Index. And and that requires a whole lot of technical skills to make it happen. So they get information from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, it goes across to Social Security, and you get a slight adjustment to your pension or payment. Okay, so if that fails, there will be consequences. Millions of Australians will be impacted. And for some of them living on benefits, even a few cents would make a real difference to their quality of life. Now, we saw that as a really big red ticket item, and at the lower level, people wanted to invest a whole lot of effort in fancy IT and all this stuff. He saw it as in an entirely different way, and he said, no, 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 no. We would handle it politically. We put a statement into Parliament and we put a public statement out saying, look, we're terribly sorry. Your CPI increase has been delayed. We'll adjust it in your next payment. And then we move heaven and earth to make it happen. But instead of investing a lot of money technically, he was saying we would invest money sort of in communications and politically. Entirely different perspective to how people at the operational level saw that problem. They saw it as a technical problem that needed more investment of IT. He saw it as a political and governance problem that needed management in the communication space.
Hmm. Interesting.
So he didn't write it out, he just dealt with it differently.
Hmm. On that note, we've come to the end of our second segment. We're talking with
Good.
Christine Miller today about enterprise risk management, and we will be right back.